we've been talking during this Middle East. I would like to come back to some of the debates that took place this morning that were more about Eastern Europe, to talk about the issue of communication and propaganda and the role it is playing in international relations and warfare. I'd specifically look at the situation of asymmetrical communication between Russia and NATO and what it means for Eastern Europe. And I will look at the three protagonists: Russia, the West, basically US and EU, and the in-between, the marchers of the different empires, Eastern Europe, and in particular, two actors which are Ukraine and Georgia. And to look at what the policies in terms of communication and propaganda, what kind of impact they have on the ground. And in order to start presenting that, I think it's important to understand what is the media landscape in each of these geographic areas, because this has a fundamental impact on the way the international relations are working. For the Russian Federation, you have a quasi-monopoly of information and a system that is fully controlled by the Kremlin, with very little competition. And in spite of the internet being well spread, actually, if you look at the survey, the immense majority of the Russian population is actually getting its information from TV. So the impact of information that you can find on the internet is extremely limited on forming public opinion in Russia. What is also striking is that communications and propaganda is of extremely high importance. According to the US Department of State, the Russian Federation is spending $1.4 billion per year on communications, both at home and internationally. 1.4 billion. It's 20 times more than what the United States are spending. Interesting. Some of you may remember that when there was the conflict in eastern Ukraine, when dead Russian soldiers were taken back to Russia, it was in great secrecy. But when dead journalists were taken back to Russia, there were national funerals. So the real important warriors in the current competition between Russia and the West are actually the journalists, much more than the little green men or the people on the ground. And of course, to some extent, the communication is very cynical, with a lot of disinformation and a lot of lies about what is happening on the ground. A few weeks ago, just before the rapprochement on the Syrian affair, there were some fake Ukrainian documents that were distributed and promoted by Russian media, explaining that the Ukrainian government ordered Ukrainian fighters to go and fight in Syria against the government, which is absolutely absurd and doesn't make sense for nobody. What is also interesting is that a lot of people are wondering and spend a lot of time discussing about what are the intentions of the President Putin. And I think the best way to read it is actually to listen to Russian TV, because it describes very, very clearly the shift in policies and in political orientation. Much more than all the communication that is done by the Russian Federation towards the West. The real center of the political message is done domestically. In the West, the political landscape is fundamentally different. We have an open media that is not directly controlled by the leadership. It doesn't mean it is not biased, it is. And if you listen to CNN or Fox News, you will have a very different picture of the world. And same if you read The Guardian or The Time. I guess one of the big difference is that the level of lies compared to what you find in the Russian media is not comparable at all. because it has a direct impact on the reputation of the journalist. But to a certain extent, it is also permeable to Russian propaganda, because Russia is spending a lot of money on that, and RT, for example, even in the United States, is widely heard, because also Western standard of journalism oblige to always present the two views. So at the beginning of the crisis in Ukraine and in Georgia, you would see the New York Times or the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal presenting the version of the fact according to NATO and the local government, and then the version of the fact according to the Russian Federation. And by simply presenting the two facts, if one fact is very, very far from the truth, it gets a sometimes very distorted version of the reality. Now, what is more interesting is what is the media landscape in between Russia and the West, and basically in countries like Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova. And here you've got three types of media. You've got the local media, the domestic media, which are relatively open, much more in Ukraine, for example, than in Georgia, but with a massive lack of professionalism and a very high level of corruption. And that allows to have a certain number of actors buying for media coverage, be it local actors or also a lot actors coming from Russia. The second type of media you find in between are the media from the West, but because of the barrier language, their impact is very limited, which is not the case with Russian media. And what is very interesting is that if you look at what has been the impact of Russian media in the conflict in Crimea and in Donbass, 4 years ago, nobody was talking about a potential independence of Donbass or Crimea. It was on nobody's agenda. All the surveys that were made locally showed that nobody wanted that. But by very heavy propaganda, this became a political agenda. And we've seen people changing their minds. And I remember vividly a friend of mine who is from Kiev, and she has a son who was studying in Crimea. But her son was originally from Kiev. And the moment he was in Crimea and he kept on listening to Russian TV talking about the fascists in Kiev, waging a war, he became extremely strongly positioned against the Ukrainian government as a direct result of the state propaganda. And a certain number of observers have seen exactly the same phenomenon in Donbass. So media is used as part of a military strategy to prepare military interventions and to shape the environment in a way that is favorable. And once the territories are occupied, be it in Crimea or in Donbass or in part of Georgia, then all foreign media or all local media are being shut down in order to maintain the same situation of monopoly of media as you have in the rest of the Federation. So, in a way, Russia is defending itself against ideological infiltration from the West, but at the same time is very actively promoting its own ideology in the near abroad. So, why is this asymmetrical relationship of vis-à-vis communication and state propaganda is worrying? It's mostly worrying, I would say, for the population in Russia and for the population in the near abroad. Population in Russia, because it is getting very much polarized and radicalized because they do not have access to plurality of information. And in the near abroad, because it is at the center of the communication battlefield. And Russia is being much more active and powerful and efficient than what the West is doing, or even is trying to do. There's a recent initiative from Brussels that is called EU Mythbusters, that is here to counter some of the propaganda, but that's extremely limited. And even if you look at the work that is being done by the US AID or other international actors, the scale of the effort is absolutely not comparable to what Russia is investing. And this is a challenge not only for countries which are far away from NATO, but also for countries which are within NATO. And if you look at the situation in the Baltic states, the fact that the Russian communication has such an impact on what people believe, and that it could actually be a way to shape the environment for potential military action, is a very worrying sign. So I think that the main question in terms of countering Russian propaganda and engaging with the region is to which extent the EU and the United States will be ready to invest massively in the communication in the region in order to have more competition and diversity of point of view for the local population in local language, which is definitely not the case now. Thank you.